Before we begin tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference for us. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe to the channel. It truly means everything. Now let's begin. Imagine standing in a city where justice has become a memory, where the courts favor the wealthy, where violence goes unpunished, where the faithful watch their world crumble, while corrupt officials grow fat on bribes. Imagine believing in a God of justice while watching that justice fail every single day. Imagine feeling the weight of that contradiction pressing on your chest with every breath, making you question everything you thought you knew about how reality works. Now imagine having the courage to look up at the heavens and ask God directly, "Why aren't you doing anything about this? Why do the wicked prosper while the righteous suffer? Why does evil go unpunished while good goes unrewarded?" This is the story of Habakkuk, a prophet unlike any other in Scripture, a man who dared to question the silence of God, a man who refused to accept easy answers or pious platitudes, a man whose honest struggle with faith produced one of the most profound statements about trust ever recorded in human history. The world Habakkuk lived in the kingdom of Judah in the late 7th century, before the Common Era was dying from within, not from invasion, not from natural disaster, but from moral rot that had infected every level of society like a disease spreading through a body, destroying it from the inside out. The streets of Jerusalem, once bustling with honest trade and genuine worship, once famous throughout the region as a city where justice dwelt, had become theaters of corruption, so normalized that people barely noticed anymore. What had been shocking to their grandparents was routine to them. What should have provoked outrage was met with shrugs. Habakkuk walked those streets every day, and every day the weight pressed heavier on his chest. He saw the widow at the city gate, tears streaming down her weathered face as the judge waved her away without even pretending to listen to her case. She'd come seeking justice after her neighbor seized her late husband's field through legal trickery, using debts and contracts to steal what should have been her son's inheritance. But the judge would not even hear her case, not without silver changing hands first, not without a bribe she could never afford. The neighbor who stole her land stood nearby, smiling, arms crossed, knowing the system protected the wealthy and crushed the powerless. He did not even bother to hide his satisfaction. Why should he? There were no consequences for his theft. Habakkuk watched young men beaten in broad daylight by gangs of thugs, their cries for help met with closed doors and averted eyes. The authorities knew who these criminals were. Everyone knew. Shopkeepers could point them out by name. Families knew to avoid certain streets when these men were around. But they operated with complete impunity because they paid the right people, because they had connections to powerful families, because the system that should have stopped them was too corrupt to function. Violence had become so common that mothers no longer let their children play in certain neighborhoods. Honest men carried weapons just to walk to the market, and even that was no guarantee of safety. He saw merchants adjust their scales with practiced casualness, adding weights when buying from the poor, removing them when selling back to those same people. The lie was so routine they barely bothered to hide it anymore. Some of these same merchants would quote scripture in the morning at the temple, speaking eloquently of God's justice and righteousness, praising the Almighty's perfect law. Then they would spend the afternoon cheating widows and orphans without a moment's pause, without any sense of contradiction. The disconnect between what people claim to believe and how they actually lived become a chasm so wide that nobody even remarked on it anymore. The religious leaders were perhaps the worst because they should have known better. They wore fine robes embroidered with blue and purple thread that cost more than most families earned in a year. They spoke eloquently about the covenant, about God's law, about Israel's special relationship with the Almighty. Their prayers sounded beautiful. Their knowledge of Scripture was extensive. But Habakkuk saw how they actually lived when the prayers were done and the robes were laid aside. They built large houses with multiple rooms and expensive furnishings, while the poor starved in wells. They accumulated wealth through temple positions that should have been about service, not profit. They used their authority not to guide people toward righteousness, but to enrich themselves and maintain their status. The temple, which should have been the beating heart of justice and mercy, had become just another corrupt institution where influence could be bought and truth could be sold to the highest bidder. The agricultural system that had once sustained families for generations, that had provided stability and dignity to even modest farmers, was collapsing under the weight of organized greed. Rich landowners had discovered they could use debt as a weapon more effective than any sword. They would loan money to small farmers at rates that seemed manageable. Then they would wait. One bad harvest, one sick child requiring medicine, one unexpected expense, and the farmer could not make his payment. The contract would be called in immediately with no mercy, no extension, no consideration for years of faithful payment. The land would be seized, legal, lawful, completely in accordance with contracts that had been signed and witnessed. The fact that it was systemic theft dressed up in legal language did not make it less evil. It made it worse because now injustice wore the mask of law. Habakkuk watched families lose farms their ancestors had worked for 10 generations. He saw children whose great-grandparents had owned their own land, had passed down fields and vineyards and olive groves as inheritance reduced to working as day laborers for the very men who stole that inheritance. The wealthy grew wealthier by making the poor poor, and the courts that should have provided remedy were part of the problem, not the solution. Judges took bribes so openly that people calculated the cost of justice the way they calculated the cost of grain. Can you afford a ruling in your favor? No. Then do not bother bringing your case. You will just waste your time and face the humiliation of watching the judge rule against clear evidence because the other side paid him more. Meanwhile, grain rotted in the storehouses of the wealthy. Not because there was too much grain, not because Judah was so prosperous that food went to waste out of abundance. The grain rotted because holding it back drove up prices. Wealthy merchants would buy up grain at harvest when prices were low, store it in massive warehouses, then wait. As supplies in the market dwindled, as families began to struggle, prices would climb. Only then would they release their grain, selling it for 2 or 3 times what they paid. People went hungry while food spoiled, all so that rich merchants could extract higher profits. The prophets of old, men like Amos and Isaiah, had thundered against such practices, calling them an abomination, declaring that God would judge those who hoarded food while the poor starved. But their words had been forgotten, filed away as ancient history. Or worse, they had been twisted and reinterpreted until they meant nothing, until they were just nice poems to recite at religious festivals. But what made it worse, what made it unbearable for Habakkuk, was that the righteous suffered most of all. This was not just a corrupt system where everyone was equally compromised. This was a system where choosing righteousness meant choosing poverty, isolation, and suffering. The honest merchant who refused to cheat, who kept accurate scales and fair prices, found his business dwindling as customers went to competitors who offered better deals made possible by dishonest practices. Why pay fair prices when you could get cheaper goods from the merchant who cheated on his weights? The fair judge who refused bribes, who tried to rule according to law and evidence, was pressured out of his position, replaced by someone more willing to play the game. The family that followed God's law, that treated their workers fairly and priced goods honestly and helped the poor and widowed as Scripture commanded, found themselves growing poorer year by year, while their corrupt neighbors built bigger houses and threw lavish feasts. There was no reward for righteousness. There was no punishment for wickedness. The moral order that was supposed to govern reality, that was supposed to ensure that good was blessed and evil was cursed, seemed to have broken down completely. Good people prayed for justice and watched injustice triumph daily. Evil people mocked God openly, not even bothering to hide their contempt for divine law. And they lived in luxury and died in honor. The wicked were not just tolerated in Judah. They were admired, envied, held up as successful examples of how to thrive in the world. And Habakkuk, standing in the middle of this moral wasteland, could not reconcile what he saw with what he believed. He believed in a God of justice. The scriptures he had memorized as a child declared that God loved justice, that righteousness was the foundation of his throne. He believed in a God who heard prayers. The Psalms sang of a God who listened to the cries of the oppressed. He believed in a God who protected the righteous and punished the wicked. The law itself promised blessing for obedience and curse for disobedience. But everywhere Habakkuk looked, the evidence contradicted those beliefs. Reality seemed to be mocking his faith, laughing at everything he'd been taught was true. Habakkuk was a prophet, but not the kind most people imagine. He didn't stand in the temple court shouting warnings to crowds, calling them to repentance in a loud voice that echoed off stone walls. He didn't confront kings in their palaces, pointing his finger at royal faces and declaring divine judgment. He didn't perform miracles or call down fire from heaven or heal the sick to prove his authority. Habakkuk's prophecy was quieter, more intimate, and in some ways more dangerous because Habakkuk spoke to God himself. And he didn't whisper polite prayers, the kind of prayers that people pray when they want to sound religious. He didn't use formal language designed to impress listeners or follow the expected formulas for proper prayer. He demanded answers. Night after night, as the sun set and Jerusalem's lights began to flicker across the valley, Habakkuk would leave the city. Maybe he climbed to a watchtower on the city walls, one of the high points where guards stood scanning the horizon for approaching enemies. Maybe it was just a hill outside the gates where he could see the entire city spread below him. A sprawling collection of buildings and people engaged in their corrupt routines, and there alone under the vast canopy of stars where nobody could hear him except God, he would pray. Not prayers of praise or gratitude, not the prayers of someone who believed everything was going according to plan. Prayers of raw, honest, almost desperate confusion. How long, O Lord, must I call for help? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? These were not the questions of a man losing faith, of someone about to walk away from God and join the cynical masses who had given up on righteousness. These were the questions of a man whose faith demanded better. Habakkuk believed in God's justice so deeply that the absence of it felt like betrayal. He believed God heard prayers, so why did nothing change? Why did his daily cries for intervention meet with silence? He believed God loved his people, so why did the faithful suffer while the wicked prospered? Why did those who honored God live in fear, while those who mocked God lived in comfort? The silence was perhaps the worst part. Habakkuk prayed and waited, watching the darkness deepen, listening for any response. He watched the stars wheel slowly overhead, marking the passage of hours. He listened to the wind and the distant sounds of the city settling for the night, and God said nothing. Day after day, night after night, the prophet poured out his heart, and heaven remained silent. Habakkuk's first cry. The breaking point came on an evening that started like any other. Habash had witnessed something that day, some particular injustice that proved to be the final straw. Maybe it was a child orphaned by violence, crying in the street while people walked past pretending not to notice. Maybe it was an old man beaten for defending his neighbor, his body left in an alley as a warning to others who might consider being righteous. Maybe it was just one more corrupt verdict in a court that was supposed to represent God's law. One more widow denied justice. One more family robbed by legal theft. Whatever it was, the incident crystallized everything Habakkuk had been feeling, brought all his frustration to a head. He climbed to his watching place as the light faded from the sky, and when he opened his mouth to pray, everything poured out like water from a broken dam. How long must I cry out to you about violence, and you do not save? Why do you show me iniquity and look at trouble? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and contention rises up everywhere. The law is paralyzed and justice never goes forth. The wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Everything is backwards. Everything is wrong, and you do nothing. His voice echoed in the darkness, not shouting exactly, but intense, urgent, desperate. The words came faster, spilling out with all the pent-up confusion and pain of months or perhaps years of watching evil triumph. This was not a man rejecting God. This was a man clinging to God so tightly that he refused to accept easy answers or pious platitudes. If God was just, Habakkuk needed to understand why justice was absent from the world. If God was good, Habakkuk needed to know why goodness was punished and evil rewarded. If God was powerful, Habakkuk needed an explanation for why that power seemed dormant, while wickedness spread unchecked. The prophet's complaint was radical in its honesty, shocking in its directness. In that ancient world, questioning God could be seen as blasphemy, as a lack of faith, as the kind of presumption that should be punished. Who was this human to demand explanations from the Creator? Who was he to accuse the Almighty of inaction? But Habakkuk understood something profound, something many people never grasp. Real faith is strong enough to hold real questions. Doubt expressed to God. Honest confusion brought before the divine throne. It's not the same as doubt that turns away from God and walks into cynicism or atheism. Wrestling with God means you still believe God is there to wrestle with. Arguing with God means you still believe God exists and cares enough to argue back. So Habakkuk waited after his cry. He had asked his questions, poured out his complaint, laid bare his confusion. Now he stationed himself like a watchman on duty, scanning the horizon, not for enemy armies, but for some sign, some word, some indication that God had heard him and would respond. He sat there in the darkness alone, with his thoughts and his faith and his questions, and he waited. The night stretched long and silent. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering, unconcerned with questions of justice. The city below settled into uneasy sleep. Its injustices paused until morning, when they would resume like always. The same corruption playing out in the same ways with the same victims and the same perpetrators. And Habakkuk waited, barely breathing, straining to hear or sense or feel any response from the God he believed in, but could not currently understand God's unexpected response. When the answer came, it was not gentle. There was no soft voice whispering comfort. There was no reassuring presence telling Habakkuk that everything would be fine. God spoke, and the words were not what the prophet expected or wanted to hear. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. Habakkuk straightened his heart, quickening. Finally, God was responding. Finally, there would be justice, action, intervention. He leaned forward, listening intently. For behold, I am racing up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their justice and dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than evening wolves. Their horsemen charge from afar, galloping forward with power. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence. Their faces surge forward like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. The prophet's breath caught in his throat. His mind struggled to process what he was hearing. The Chaldeans, the Babylonians, the most ruthless empire in the known world. Famous throughout the region for their cruelty, their violence, their complete disregard for any law except their own power. An empire that conquered not just to expand territory, but to crush and humiliate defeated peoples. An empire that boasted of its victories by describing in graphic detail how they treated conquered populations. God was saying that judgment was coming to Judah. That was clear enough. But the instrument of that judgment, the tool God planned to use, would be Babylon itself. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. They build earthen ramps and capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. Habakkuk stood frozen, trying to process what he had just heard. He had cried out against injustice, and God's answer was to bring more injustice. He had complained about violence, and God was sending the most violent nation on earth. He had protested the prosperity of the wicked, and God was using even more wicked people as his tool of correction. How was this justice? How did this address anything he had complained about? This was not the answer Habakkuk had expected. In his mind, he had imagined God sweeping in to rescue the righteous and punish the wicked. He had pictured justice descending like rain, washing away corruption and restoring what was right. He had thought maybe God would raise up a righteous king like David, or send a prophet with power like Moses, or simply intervene directly to fix what was broken. Instead, God was describing an invasion, a conquest, a catastrophe that would sweep away guilty and innocent alike. That would make the current suffering look mild by comparison. The prophet's mind reeled. The Babylonians were worse than the corrupt officials in Judah. They were more violent than the gangs that terrorized Jerusalem's streets. They were greedier than the merchants with false scales. They were more oppressive than the wealthy landowners who stole family farms. How could this be God's answer? How could this be the action of a good and just deity? A second, deeper question. Habakkuk could have walked away at that moment. He could have decided that God's ways were too confusing, too harsh, too contradictory to his sense of right and wrong. He could have chosen silence, resignation, bitterness. He could have joined the cynics who had given up on the idea that reality had any moral structure at all. He could have decided that faith was pointless if this was how God operated. Instead, he pressed deeper. Instead of turning away, he leaned in. Instead of ending the conversation, he continued it with even more intensity. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for correction. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? This second complaint was even more profound than the first. Habakkuk was not rejecting God's answer. He was taking it seriously enough to question it more deeply, to push further into the contradiction he saw. If God is holy, how can he use unholy nations as instruments? If God hates injustice, how can he employ the unjust to accomplish his purposes? If God's eyes are too pure to look on evil, how can he partner with the most evil empire on earth? The prophet continued, his words tumbling out with the desperation of someone trying to reconcile what they believe with what they're being told. He compared humanity to fish caught in nets, helpless before the power of empires, unable to resist or escape. He described the Babylonians as worshiping their own military might, offering sacrifices to their swords and nets, as if weapons themselves were gods, as if power itself was divine. Should they therefore empty their nets and continue to destroy nations without mercy? Should they just keep conquering forever, growing fat on the suffering of others, treating people like resources to be exploited? Is there no end to their violence? No limit to their oppression? The question hung in the air, unanswered for the moment. The darkness pressed close. The city slept unaware of the conversation taking place, unaware of the judgment being described, and Habakkuk stationed himself again, this time explicitly describing what he was doing, making his posture and intention absolutely clear. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. This was the posture of true faith, not blind acceptance that stops asking questions, not resignation that gives up on understanding, not cynicism that assumes there are no good answers, but active waiting, expectant listening, determined persistence. Habakkuk was saying in effect, I do not understand, but I will not stop listening. I am troubled, but I will not turn away. I have more questions, but I believe there are answers, even if I cannot see them yet. I will wait here until clarity comes, or until I understand why clarity is not coming. He waited again, this time with even more intentionality. And this time the answer that came would change everything, would shift the entire ground of the conversation, would provide not the explanation Habakkuk wanted, but the perspective he needed, the watchman's vision. The second response from God was different in tone from the first. Not harsh or startling, not shocking or terrifying, but measured, deliberate, weighted with importance. This was something meant to be remembered, something that would matter not just for that moment, but for all the moments to come, for generations who would face the same struggles. Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false, though it linger. Wait for it. It will certainly come. and will not delay beyond its appointed moment. God was telling Habakkuk to make a record, to write down what he was about to hear so clearly that anyone could read it at a glance, so plainly that a person running past could catch its meaning. This was a message not just for that generation, but for the future, for people who would need these words in their own times of confusion and doubt, for believers centuries or millennia later who would struggle with the same questions about justice delayed and evil temporarily triumphant. Then came the line that would echo through all of human history, that would become foundational to the entire theology of faith. The righteous shall live by faith. 5 words. 5 simple words that contain an entire understanding of how human beings relate to God, how faith operates in a broken world, how trust survives when understanding fails. 5 words that the Apostle Paul would later quote as the heart of the gospel. 5 words that would become the battle cry of the Protestant Reformation. 5 words that countless believers would cling to in moments of doubt and suffering. The righteous shall live by faith, not by sight, not by understanding, not by having all questions answered or all doubts resolved, not by seeing justice happen immediately or evil punished quickly. Faith, trust, confidence in God's character, even when God's actions seem confusing. Belief in the ultimate reality of justice, even when injustice appears to triumph. Truly living based on what you trust about God, rather than what you can see with your eyes. God continued explaining the principle more fully. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright. But the righteous person will live by his faithfulness, by his steady trust, by his refusal to abandon what he knows to be true about God's character, even when circumstances seem to contradict it. The contrast was being drawn clearly. The Babylonians looked powerful, unstoppable, like they would conquer forever. But their power was built on pride, on arrogance, on the belief that might makes right. That kind of power carries the seeds of its own destruction within it. It cannot last because it has no foundation beyond itself, no source of renewal, no connection to anything eternal. Eventually, inevitably, it will collapse under its own weight. The righteous, on the other hand, might look weak right now. They might be suffering. They might seem defeated, but they are connected to something that does not change, rooted in the character of God, which is eternal. Their faithfulness, their steady trust, their refusal to abandon righteousness, even when it costs them everything. This connects them to reality at its deepest level. Habakkuk began to understand something he had not seen before. Something that required a completely different way of thinking about time and justice. He had been thinking about justice in immediate terms, measuring it in days and years, expecting it to operate on human timescales. But God was describing justice on a larger scale across nations and generations, operating according to principles that played out over centuries rather than moments. Evil might prosper for a season, but only for a season. Injustice might seem to triumph temporarily, but temporary is the key word. The moral structure of reality itself ensures that wickedness cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Evil carries the seeds of its own destruction. Babylon might be used as God's instrument, but Babylon itself would eventually face judgment for its own evil. The same moral laws that apply to Judah apply to every nation, every person, every system of power. This was not an excuse for inaction or an acceptance of evil. This was not a shrug and a "well, that's just how things are." This was a deeper understanding of how justice actually works in a complex world where human freedom and divine sovereignty intersect in ways that transcend simple cause and effect, where the immediate and the eternal are woven together in patterns too large for humans to see all at once. The five woes. Then God began to pronounce judgment, not on Judah, but on the very Babylonians he had just described as his instrument of correction. 5 times God declared, "Woe," each one targeting a specific form of injustice that Babylon embodied, each one revealing how evil contains its own punishment. Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long will this go on? Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey because you have plundered many nations. The peoples who are left will plunder you, for you have shed human blood and done violence to lands and cities and all who live in them. The first woe was against greed, against accumulating wealth through theft and oppression, against building empires on stolen resources. God was saying that those who plunder create their own enemies. Those who build through exploitation create the very forces that will tear them down. The plundered will eventually become the plunderers. The conquered will eventually become the conquerors. The cycle of violence perpetuates itself, and those who start it cannot control where it ends. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. The second woe was against those who use power to insulate themselves from consequences while destroying others, who build fortresses and think themselves safe behind high walls and strong gates. God was saying that no amount of security measures can protect those whose foundation is injustice. They may feel secure, may believe themselves invulnerable, but they're building on sand. The very walls they build to protect themselves will testify against them. Their apparent safety is an illusion. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people exhaust themselves for nothing? That the nations weary themselves only for fire? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. The third woe was against violence used to build empires, against cities constructed on foundations of corpses, against glory purchased with blood. God was saying that all that effort, all that conquest, all that bloodshed ultimately produces nothing lasting. Nations that build through violence are building furnaces that will consume what they create. Their monuments will crumble, their cities will burn, their names will become synonyms for evil rather than power. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin till they're drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. You will be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The fourth woe was against those who humiliate and degrade others, who take pleasure in making people vulnerable, who use their power to strip dignity from those who cannot defend themselves. God was saying that the humiliator will be humiliated, that dignity stripped from others will be stripped from the perpetrator, that those who expose others will themselves be exposed. Justice includes a principle that you reap what you sow, that the treatment you give others becomes the treatment you receive. Woe to him who says to wood, "Come to life," or to lifeless stone, "Wake up." Can it give guidance? It is covered with gold and silver. There is no breath in it, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. The fifth woe was against idolatry, against trusting in created things rather than the Creator, against worshiping power or wealth or military might as if these things were divine. God was saying that nations built on false foundations, on worship of things that cannot give life, are nations built on nothing. They may look impressive, covered in gold and silver, decorated with precious materials, but they have no breath in them, no life, no future. Each woe reflected something Habakkuk had witnessed in Judah: greed, unjust gain, violence, degradation, idolatry. All of it was present in his own society. Each one also predicted the downfall of Babylon. The same moral laws apply to everyone. Judah's corruption would bring judgment through Babylon, but Babylon's corruption would bring its own judgment in turn. The evil that Babylon used against others would eventually be turned against Babylon on itself. The universe has a moral structure that cannot be ignored indefinitely. Actions have consequences that play out across time. Justice might be delayed, giving opportunity for repentance, giving time for change, but that patience has limits. God was not indifferent to evil. He was patient, giving time for people and nations to turn from wickedness. But when that patience was exhausted, judgment would come. Habakkuk listened to all five woes, and something shifted in his chest. The anger that had driven him to that watchtower night after night began to transform into something else. Not acceptance of evil, not a shrug of resignation, but a deeper trust that evil cannot ultimately win. That injustice contains the seeds of its own destruction, that the moral order of reality is real even when it operates on timescales larger than individual human lives. Fear gives way to reverence. The tone of Habakkuk's prophecy changed dramatically in the final chapter. Where before he had been questioning, demanding, complaining, now he was remembering. Where before he had been focused obsessively on present injustice, on the corruption he saw every day, now he was recalling God's power throughout history, remembering who he was actually talking to, putting his complaints in perspective. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Lord, repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Habakkuk's mind went back to the stories every child in Judah learned, the foundational narrative of their people, the history that defined who they were. He remembered God coming from Taman, the Holy One from Mount Pon, his glory covering the heavens like a canopy, his praise filling the earth like sound filling a chamber. He remembered descriptions of God's splendor being like the sunrise, rays flashing from his hand, or his power was hidden, contained, held back so it would not consume everything. He thought about the plagues in Egypt when the most powerful empire on earth, the nation that had enslaved Israel for generations, was brought to its knees. 10 times God struck Egypt, each plague more terrible than the last, demonstrating that Pharaoh's power was nothing compared to divine power, that all the military might of Egypt could not stand against the God who controlled nature itself. He remembered the parting of the sea, the moment when Israel stood trapped between the advancing Egyptian army and the water with nowhere to run, no way to escape, facing certain death or enslavement. And God split the sea, water standing up like walls on either side, an entire nation walking through on dry ground while their enemies were drowned trying to follow. He thought about Mount Sinai, the mountain that trembled when God descended on it, the ground shaking with such violence the people thought the world was ending. Smoke and fire and thunder and lightning. The people so terrified they begged Moses to speak to God for them because they could not bear to hear his voice directly. The raw power was too much, too overwhelming, too far beyond anything human experience could prepare them for. He remembered nations trembling at news of Israel's advance, mighty warriors who had never known, fear-feeing terror at reports of what God had done. He remembered mountains crumbling, ancient hills collapsing, eternal pathways being torn apart when God moved. He remembered the sun and moon standing still in the sky, time itself bending to accommodate divine purposes. He remembered rivers rebuked and responding like living things aware of their Creator. Seas pushed back and forward at divine command. And Habakkuk realized something crucial, something that cut through all his confusion and complaints. The God who seemed silent was the same God who had never been powerless. The God who allowed temporary injustice was the same God who had overthrown empires. The God who waited, who seemed patient to the point of inaction, was the same God who, when he moved with unstoppable force that nothing could resist. I heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. This was not the fear of punishment, not the terror of someone expecting to be hurt. This was awe. This was the overwhelming recognition of standing before infinite power, infinite holiness, infinite otherness. This was the response of a creature finally grasping the vast gulf between himself and the Creator. Habakkuk was trembling, not because he was afraid God would harm him, but because he was finally seeing clearly how vast God actually was, how small he himself was by comparison, how limited his perspective had been. And yet mingled with that awe, woven through that trembling recognition of divine power, was something else. Peace, trust, a settling in his spirit that had been restless for so long, a quieting of the questions that had driven him to that watchtower night after night. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. Habakkuk could wait now, not because he understood everything, not because all his questions had been answered to his satisfaction, not because the situation had changed or justice had suddenly appeared in the streets of Jerusalem. He could wait because he had remembered who God was, not because his complaints were invalid, but because he trusted the character of the one he had been complaining to. The quiet turning point. Then Habakkuk did something remarkable, something that stands as one of the most powerful statements of faith in all of human literature. He imagined the worst possible scenario, the complete collapse of everything that sustained life, and declared his response to it. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stools yet, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. Think carefully about what he was describing. In an agricultural society, in a world where nearly everyone depended directly on crops and livestock for survival, this was not just inconvenience or difficulty. This was total economic collapse. This was famine. This was starvation. This was watching your children go hungry, watching your family waste away, facing your own death from lack of food. This was the end of livelihood, security, hope for the future, everything that made life sustainable. No figs meant no fruit for eating or trading, no sweet food to sustain you, no crop to sell in the market. No grapes meant no wine. which was not a luxury but a staple of the diet, a source of calories and nutrition, a major trade good that provided income. No olives meant no oil for cooking, no fuel for lamps that push back the darkness, no medicine for wounds, no base for perfumes and ointments. No grain in the fields meant no bread, no basic food at all, no seed for next year's planting, no hope of future harvest, no sheep meant no wool for clothing to keep warm in winter, no meat for protein, no milk for children and the elderly, no animals to trade or sell when money was needed, no cattle meant no oxen to pull plows for planting, no leather for sandals and belts and water bags, no large animals to sell in emergencies, no resources for survival. Habakkuk was describing complete and utter devastation, the kind of comprehensive loss that would leave people with nothing, that would make survival itself questionable. He was painting a picture of the very worst outcome, the scenario where the Babylonian invasion destroyed everything, where judgment fell without discrimination, where the righteous suffered just as much as the wicked. He was imagining total loss, absolute destitution, the failure of everything people depended on for life itself. And he was saying, even then, even in that absolute worst case that I can imagine, I will rejoice. This was not optimism. Optimism says things will get better, that dark clouds have silver linings, that every valley has a mountain on the other side. Habakkuk was not predicting improvement. He was not saying the fig trees would bud eventually, or the disaster would not be as bad as feared. He was describing complete loss and declaring his response to it. This was not denial. Denial says things are not really that bad, that you're exaggerating, that surely it cannot be as terrible as you're making it sound. Habakkuk was not minimizing the catastrophe. He was acknowledging how bad things could actually become, how complete the destruction might be, how total the loss. This was faith, pure, refined, tested, unshakable faith. Faith that says my trust in God is not conditional on God giving me what I want. My joy in God does not depend on God giving me what I need. My relationship with God is not a transaction where I worship and He blesses. I will rejoice in God Himself, not in what God does for me. I will find joy in God's character, not in my circumstances. The prophet had moved from questioning God's actions to trusting God's character regardless of actions. He had moved from demanding justice now to believing in justice ultimately, even if that ultimately stretched beyond his lifetime. He had moved from needing to understand to accepting mystery while maintaining trust. He had moved from faith that required favorable circumstances to faith that could survive any circumstance. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights, even in devastation, even in loss, even in famine and suffering, even in the valley of death itself. God would give him stability. The image Habakkuk used was powerful and deliberate. Deer navigate steep, rocky terrain with sure-footedness that seems impossible to any who watch them. They leap from rock to rock on mountain sides where the paths are narrow and the drops are fatal, and they do it with grace and confidence that appears effortless. Habakkuk was saying, I do not know where this path leads. I cannot see the way forward clearly. The terrain ahead looks dangerous, treacherous, possibly fatal. But God will guide my steps. I will have the stability to keep moving even when the path is terrifying. The heights, the dangerous places, the times when one wrong step could mean disaster. God will make me able to navigate those, not by making the path easier, but by giving me the sure-footedness to handle the difficult path that actually exists. This was not passive resignation, not a shrug of defeat disguised as faith. This was active trust, deliberate choice, a decision to believe even when belief was hard. This was choosing to rejoice without knowing the outcome, to trust without guarantees, to hope without certainty, faith without reward. The book of Habakkuk ends without neat resolution. There is no postscript saying, and then everything turned out fine. There is no epilogue explaining that Habakkuk's questions were answered to his satisfaction, and he lived happily ever after. His faith rewarded with prosperity and peace. There is no divine intervention that prevented the Babylonian invasion from happening. No last-minute rescue that spared Judah from judgment. Instead, the book ends with a prophet who has been transformed not by getting answers, but by deepening his trust. The circumstances that troubled him have not changed. The injustice he complained about still exists in the streets of Jerusalem. The corrupt judges still take bribes. The merchants still cheat. The gangs still terrorize. The wealthy still oppress. Nothing external has been resolved. The Babylonian invasion is still coming, still promised as certain, still destined to bring catastrophe. But everything internal has shifted. Habakkuk is not the same man who climbed that watchtower the first time, angry and confused and desperate for God to act according to his timeline and his understanding. He has become someone fundamentally different, someone who can trust without seeing, who can hope without guarantees, who can rejoice without rewards. He has learned to live by faith, and in learning that, in making that shift from demanding understanding to choosing trust, he has become an example for every generation that would follow. A model of what mature faith actually looks like. A demonstration that true faith is not about having all your questions answered, but about believing in the character of God when answers do not come. This is one of the most mature expressions of faith in all of Scripture. Not faith that demands proof before believing, not faith that requires understanding before trusting, not faith that needs constant reassurance and visible evidence. Faith that can look at the worst possible scenario, imagine total loss, picture complete devastation, and say, "Yet I will rejoice." The principle Habakkuk learned, that simple five-word statement that the righteous shall live by faith, became foundational to all later theology. When the Apostle Paul was explaining to the Romans and Galatians how people are made right with God, he quoted this line from Habakkuk. When the writer of Hebrews was defining what faith actually means and how it operates, he pointed back to this principle. When the Protestant reformers were challenging the religious systems of their day, they returned to this truth as bedrock. When believers throughout history have faced persecution, exile, martyrdom, loss of every kind, they have drawn strength from Habakkuk's example, because Habakkuk showed that faith is not about having your prayers answered the way you want. Faith is not about understanding God's plan or seeing justice happen on your preferred timeline. Faith is not about life going smoothly or evil being punished quickly or righteousness being rewarded immediately. Faith is about holding on to God when everything else is stripped away. Faith is about trusting God's character when God's actions seem incomprehensible or even contradictory. Faith is about believing justice is real, even when injustice is all you can see. Faith is about choosing joy in God Himself rather than joy in what God gives you, a prophet for every generation. The questions Habakkuk asked 3,000 years ago have never stopped being relevant. Every generation, Every century, every era of human history has faced the same fundamental struggles. Why does evil prosper while good suffers? Why do the wicked thrive while the righteous barely survive? Why does God seem silent when we cry out? Why does justice take so long? Why do answers not come when we desperately need them? In every century, in every culture, in every part of the world, people have watched corruption go unpunished. They have seen violence rewarded with power. They have witnessed the innocent crushed while the guilty prosper and grow fat on their ill-gotten gains. They have prayed for intervention that did not come, for relief that was delayed, for justice that seemed to never arrive, for mercy that appeared to be forgotten. And in every century, some have responded the way Habakkuk did, not by abandoning faith entirely, not by walking away from God in disgust or bitterness, but by taking faith seriously enough to question it, not by turning away from God, but by turning toward God with honest confusion and desperate hope, not by pretending to have easy answers, but by wrestling with hard questions while refusing to let go of trust. Habakkuk shows us that questioning is not the opposite of faith. Questioning is faith taking itself seriously enough to demand coherence, to insist on meaning, to refuse superficial explanations. Doubt expressed to God is not faithlessness. It is faithfulness that refuses to settle for shallow understanding or pious platitudes that sound nice but ring hollow. The prophet also shows us that God does not need our protection. God is not threatened by our questions. God is not offended by our honesty. The divine ego is not so fragile that it requires constant praise and never tolerates complaint or confusion. What God desires is relationship, and real relationship, authentic connection between persons includes disagreement, confusion, wrestling, and struggle. Real relationship is strong enough to hold tension without breaking. Real relationship does not require pretending everything is fine when it is not, does not demand fake smiles and force positivity when genuine pain and confusion are what we actually feel. But Habakkuk also shows us the destination of honest questioning, the place where genuine wrestling with God leads not to cynicism, not to bitterness, not to rejection, but to deeper trust, more mature faith, stronger commitment, the kind of faith that has been tested and proven, that has asked hard questions and found that while specific answers may not always come, the character of God remains trustworthy. The prophet, who began by demanding answers, ended by finding something better than answers. He found a God who could be trusted even without explanations. He found a faith that could survive even the worst possibilities he could imagine. He found a peace that was not dependent on circumstances, that could exist even in famine and loss, that was rooted in something deeper than whether life was going well. In a world that still struggles with unanswered prayers, with justice delayed, with evil apparently triumphant, Habakkuk's words echo across millennia. The righteous shall live by faith, not by sight, not by understanding, not by having it all figured out, not by seeing their prayers answered immediately or their questions resolved satisfactorily, by faith. Faith that can wait when waiting is hard and feels like abandonment. Faith that can trust when trust seems foolish and everyone around you is cynical. Faith that can rejoice even when there is no immediate reason for joy. When circumstances are terrible and getting worse, faith that can hold on to God's character when God's actions make no sense. This is the faith Habakkuk discovered on that watchtower through those long nights of questioning and waiting and listening. This is the faith that sustains believers when everything else fails, when answers do not come, when prayers seem unanswered, when justice is nowhere to be found. This is the faith that recognizes that silence does not mean absence, that delayed justice is not abandoned justice, that the God who seems to do nothing is the God who has never stopped working according to purposes larger than we can see. Habakkuk climbed down from his watchtower, eventually a different man than the one who climbed up. The world below had not changed. The injustice still filled the streets. The corrupt judges still perverted justice. The violence still terrorized the weak. The wealthy still oppressed the poor. The Babylonian invasion was still coming, still promised, still certain. Nothing about his circumstances had improved, but the prophet had been transformed. He had learned to live by faith rather than by sight. And in learning that, in making that fundamental shift in how he related to God and understood reality, he gave a gift to every generation that would follow him. A gift of honest questions asked to God rather than thrown into the void. A gift of patient waiting that does not demand instant answers. A gift of unwavering trust that can survive even when understanding fails completely. The prophet who dared to question God became the prophet who showed us that such questioning, when done in genuine faith rather than cynical rejection, leads not away from God, but deeper into the mystery of divine love and justice. Not necessarily to answers that satisfy the mind and resolve all intellectual puzzles, but to peace that sustains the soul. Even when the mind cannot understand, even when circumstances are terrible, even when every visible sign points toward despair, and in a world still crying out for justice, still waiting for relief, still wondering why God seems silent in the face of overwhelming evil. Habakkuk stands as an eternal witness that faith is possible even in the darkness, that trust can survive even when understanding utterly fails, that the righteous can truly live, and not merely survive by faith alone. His voice echoes across the centuries, speaking to every person who has ever felt that God was distant or uncaring, that prayers went unheard into empty skies, that justice was dying and nobody cared enough to save it. Wait, Habakkuk says across the millennia, trust even when trusting seems foolish. The revelation has an appointed time. Though it lingers, though it seems delayed beyond all reason, wait for it. It will certainly come. It will not delay beyond its divinely appointed moment, the perfect time that God has chosen according to wisdom we cannot see. And in the waiting, in the trusting, in the faith that holds on when letting go, would be so much easier. The righteous find that they are not just surviving, not merely enduring, not grimly hanging on until it is finally over. They are living truly, fully living, living by faith. Hey everyone, welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something that would genuinely help us out. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel more than you possibly know. Seriously, it makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people who love this kind of content. Also, if you want to drop a comment telling us what time it is for you right now and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. No pressure though, only if you feel like it. And of course, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It keeps us going. All right, let's get into it. A whisper in the darkness. Imagine a night so quiet you can hear the oil lamps flickering. Picture a massive stone sanctuary in the ancient city of Shiloh, where shadows dance across walls that have witnessed centuries of worship. The air is thick with the scent of incense and burning oil, that peculiar combination of cedar smoke and olive essence that clings to sacred spaces. Outside, the wind moves through the hills of Israel like a whispered prayer, carrying with it the distant bleating of sheep settling for the night and the occasional call of a desert owl. Inside, in the sacred chambers near the Ark of the Covenant, a young boy lies sleeping on a simple mat. The stones beneath him still hold the warmth of the day's sun, though the night air has begun to cool. His breathing is steady, deep, the kind of sleep that comes from honest physical labor and a clear conscience. His name is Samuel. This is not a story about miracles that shake mountains or angels descending in blinding light. This is a story about something quieter, something more intimate, something that happens in the space between waking and dreaming, where the boundaries of reality become permeable. It is about a voice in the darkness, a child who learned to listen when the entire world had gone deaf, and a moment that would alter the spiritual trajectory of an entire nation. Because sometimes the most profound truths do not arrive with thunder and earthquake. Sometimes they do not announce themselves with burning bushes or pillars of fire. Sometimes they arrive in whispers, in the stillness between breaths, in the gentle calling of a name spoken 3 times before it is finally understood. What you're about to hear is one of the most mysterious and beautiful moments in ancient scripture. A moment when heaven reached down to touch earth, not through spectacular signs, but through the simple act of calling a child's name in the night. But it is also a story about silence broken, about the end of a spiritual drought, about what happens when the divine decides to speak again after generations of absence. This is the story of Samuel, the boy who heard God speak when the rest of the world had forgotten how to listen. And perhaps hidden within this ancient narrative, there are questions we have forgotten to ask. Questions about why heaven goes silent. Questions about who gets chosen to break that silence. Questions about whether the voice that called Samuel in that darkened sanctuary is still calling, still speaking, still searching for those rare individuals who know how to say, I am listening. Chapter 1. Hannah's Promise. To understand Samuel's calling, we must first understand how he came to be sleeping in that sanctuary. His story begins not with him, but with his mother, a woman named Hannah, who knew the bitter taste of desperation and the hollow ache of prayers that seemed to vanish into an empty sky. In the hill country of Ephraim, in a small village whose name has been lost to history, there lived a man named Elkanah who had 2 wives, as was common in that era. His first wife, Peninnah, had given him several children, sons to carry his name, daughters to arrange in marriage, a legacy written in flesh and blood. His second wife, Hannah, had given him only heartache and unanswered prayers. Year after year, Hannah remained childless. And in a culture where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to bear children, this was not just a personal grief, it was a social death sentence, a daily humiliation, a question mark hanging over her entire existence. Neighbors would whisper, extended family would exchange knowing glances. Even well-meaning friends would offer useless advice or suggest that perhaps she had offended God in some way, that her barrenness was divine punishment for some unknown sin. Elkanah loved Hannah. The text makes this clear. He would give her double portions at feasts, trying to compensate with material generosity for what biology had denied her. He would ask her with genuine confusion, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" It was a question born of love, but blind to understanding. He could not fathom that the issue went deeper than his affection, that Hannah's grief was not about him at all, but about her own sense of purpose, of completion, of being seen as fully human by the society around her. Penina, with the cruelty that can only come from insecurity dressed as triumph, would taunt Hannah relentlessly. Every time the family made their annual pilgrimage to the sanctuary at Shiloh to worship and offer sacrifices, Penina would remind Hannah of her barrenness. The taunts were not subtle. They were designed to cut deep to remind Hannah that in the eyes of the world she was incomplete, cursed, forgotten by the very God she came to worship. Penina would parade her children before Hannah, would make comments about how blessed she was, would turn every moment of worship into a reminder of Hannah's failure. And Hannah would weep. She would refuse to eat. The pain went beyond physical longing for a child. It touched something deeper, the existential question that haunts anyone who feels overlooked by the divine. Does God see me? Does he hear my prayers? Am I worthy of his attention? Or am I simply background noise in a universe too vast to care about one woman's grief? The pilgrimage to Shiloh was supposed to be a time of joy, of celebration, of renewal. But for Hannah, it became an annual reminder of everything she lacked. Year after year, she would go through the motions of worship while her heart broke quietly in places no one could see. One year during their pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah could bear it no longer. The weight of accumulated grief, the years of disappointment, the constant humiliation, all of it reached a breaking point. While the rest of the family feasted after the sacrifice, celebrating with wine and roasted meat, Hannah slipped away to the entrance of the sanctuary. She stood there in the place where earth met heaven, in the threshold between the mundane and the sacred, and she prayed with an intensity that went beyond words. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Her whole body shook with the force of her grief and desperation. Tears streamed down her face, her hands trembled. This was not the polite, ritualized prayer of public worship. This was raw, unfiltered communion with the divine. This was a woman pouring out her soul, holding nothing back, demanding to be heard by a God who had seemed deaf to her pleas for years. She made a vow that day, one that would echo through generations. If God would grant her a son, she would give him back to God. Not for a season, not for a few years, but for his entire life. The child would be dedicated to divine service from the moment he was weaned. It was the prayer of a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is not something to hold on to, but something to offer back to its source. She was not bargaining with God so much as she was declaring her willingness to participate in something larger than her own desires. Eli, the high priest, sat by the doorpost of the sanctuary and watched this strange woman swaying and muttering. In his aging, perhaps cynical view of human nature, shaped by years of dealing with corrupt worshippers and his own corrupt sons, he assumed she was drunk. The accusation was harsh, almost cruel. "What are you doing here, intoxicated in the house of the Lord? How dare you bring your drunkenness into this sacred space?" Hannah lifted her eyes, and in them Eli saw not the glaze of wine, but the clarity of absolute desperation, the look of someone who has nothing left to lose, who has stripped away all pretense and pride, who stands naked before God with only their need. She explained that she was not drunk, but deeply troubled, pouring out her soul before God. She had been praying out of her great anguish and grief. Something in her words, or perhaps in her eyes, or perhaps in the raw authenticity of her pain, convinced Eli. His response was both blessing and prophecy. Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant what you have asked of him." It is unclear whether Eli knew what he was saying, whether he was simply offering the standard priestly blessing, or whether something moved through him in that moment. Some whisper of the divine speaking through a man who had grown complacent in his religious duties. But the words landed on Hannah like rain on parched earth. Hannah left the sanctuary that day transformed. Her face was no longer downcast. She ate. The grief lifted from her countenance like a fog dispersing under the morning sun. She had been heard, if not by man, then by something infinitely greater. She did not yet have the child she longed for, but she had something perhaps more precious: the certainty that her prayers had reached their destination, that her voice had penetrated the silence, that she mattered to the God she served. Within the year, Hannah conceived. When she gave birth to a son, she named him Samuel, which in Hebrew carries the meaning heard by God or asked of God, or some translations suggest name of God. The name itself was a testimony, a permanent reminder that this child was an answer to prayer, a gift that came from somewhere beyond the ordinary workings of the world. Every time someone spoke his name, they were acknowledging that this boy represented the moment when heaven responded to earth, when silence gave way to acknowledgement for the first few years of his life. Samuel remained with Hannah. She nursed him, taught him his first words, held him close during thunderstorms, watched him take his first steps, knowing that each day brought them closer to the moment of separation. She must have memorized the sound of his laugh, the feel of his small hand in hers, the weight of him sleeping against her chest. She was not raising a son to keep, but a son to give away, and that knowledge must have colored every moment with a bittersweet intensity. When he was old enough to be weaned, somewhere around 3 years old by the customs of that time, Hannah kept her vow. She could have rationalized her way out of it. She could have argued that God understood that the vow was made in a moment of emotional extremity, that surely keeping her son would be acceptable. But Hannah was a woman who understood that integrity means keeping promises, even when they cost you everything. She took Samuel to Shiloh. She brought him before Eli, the same priest who had blessed her years earlier, and she said words that must have torn her heart even as she spoke them. "I am the woman who stood here praying. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." Then Hannah sang, not a lament, but a song of triumph and praise. She sang of God overturning the proud and lifting up the humble. She sang of barren women bearing children and the powerful being brought low. She sang of the Lord bringing death and giving life, bringing down to the grave and raising up. She sang of God judging the ends of the earth, giving strength to his king and exalting his anointed. Her song was radical, revolutionary, a declaration that the God she served delighted in reversing the expectations of the world, in using the weak to shame the strong, in lifting up those the world had written off as irrelevant. And then she left her son in that sanctuary and went home. Imagine being that child, too young to fully understand why your mother brought you to this vast, echoing building filled with strange smells and unfamiliar faces, and then walked away. Too young to grasp that you had become the physical embodiment of a promise, a living prayer offered back to its source. You watch her figure receding, growing smaller, disappearing down the road back to the only home you have ever known. And you're left in the care of an old man whose eyes can barely see you, whose own sons are corrupt, in a place that will become your entire world. Samuel's childhood was unlike any other in Israel. While other boys played in fields and learned their father's trades, running through olive groves and swimming in streams, Samuel grew up in the sacred space of the tabernacle. His world was one of ritual and reverence, of ancient objects and whispered prayers, of shadows and lamplight, and the constant awareness that this place was different from all other places. He opened the doors of the sanctuary each morning, flooding the holy space with light. It was his job to unlock the heavy wooden doors that seal the sacred from the profane, to let in the dawn, and with it the worshippers who would come seeking connection with the divine. He assisted Eli in the daily tasks of worship, learning the intricate patterns of sacrifice and ceremony, memorizing which offerings required which procedures, understanding the difference between sin offerings and burnt offerings and peace offerings, learning to read the subtleties of ritual purity. He tended the lamps that burned through the night, ensuring their wicks were trimmed and their oil replenished. This was not glamorous work. It required attention to detail, a willingness to wake in the darkness to check that the flames had not gutted out, and understanding that these small acts of maintenance were what kept the sacred space functioning. The lamps represented the presence of God, and Samuel learned that presence requires constant tending, constant attention, constant care. He cleaned the sacred vessels, swept the courts, washed the linens used in ceremonies, helped prepare the incense, carried water, ran errands. He memorized scriptures, learning to recite the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the tales of Moses in the Exodus, the laws given at Sinai. His education was entirely religious, entirely focused on service, entirely oriented towards something beyond himself. By all accounts, Samuel was a good child, humble, obedient, faithful in small things. The text tells us he grew in favor with both the Lord and with people. He was not resentful of his circumstances. He did not seem to chafe against the boundaries of his unusual childhood. Perhaps he had accepted that this was simply who he was, the boy who belonged to God, the boy who lived in the house of the Lord. But what must it have been like psychologically to have no mother to comfort you when you woke from nightmares, to have no siblings to quarrel and play with, to grow up watching Eli's corrupt sons come and go, seeing the way they abused their position, hearing the whispers of their misconduct, to be surrounded by holiness and yet witness its corruption, to serve faithfully while those who should have been models of righteousness displayed only greed and lust and contempt for the sacred. Did Samuel wonder why he had been left here? Did he feel abandoned by the mother who had kissed him goodbye and walked away? Did he question whether the God he served even noticed his small acts of service? The text does not tell us. We see only the external facts. A boy growing up, performing his duties, learning his role. But surely there were moments of loneliness, moments of doubt, moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy for small shoulders to carry. Hannah visited when she could. Each year during the family's annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, she would bring Samuel a new robe she'd made for him, watching him grow, trying to compress a year of mothering into a few brief encounters. These visits must have been both blessing and torment. The joy of seeing his mother mingled with the pain of watching her leave again. The new robe, a reminder that somewhere he had a home, a family, a life he was not permitted to live. Yet there is no indication that Samuel rebelled or resented his circumstances. He simply continued day after day, year after year, faithful in the small things, present in the sacred space, available to be used however God saw fit. There was no indication in those early years that he would become anything more than a helpful assistant to an aging priest, that he would one day be the voice through which God spoke to an entire nation. But God, it seems, has a habit of preparing his instruments in obscurity before bringing them into the light. Samuel was being shaped by his circumstances, formed by his loneliness, refined by his faithfulness in tasks that no one celebrated. He was learning what it meant to serve without applause, to be obedient without immediate reward, to remain present even when presence felt like punishment. He was learning to listen in the silence. Chapter 2. The State of Israel at the Time. To appreciate what happened on that quiet night when God called Samuel's name, you need to understand the spiritual condition of Israel during this period. It was, to put it simply, a disaster. But the disaster raises uncomfortable questions that the text never fully answers. Questions about divine silence. Questions about why systems of worship become corrupt. Questions about what happens when the mediators between heaven and earth become obstacles instead of conduits. The problem started with Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. These two men had inherited their father's position as priests, but they had not inherited his reverence for the sacred. They were corrupt in ways that went beyond simple moral failing. They actively perverted the worship of God, treating the sacrifices and offerings as opportunities for personal gain, turning the sacred into the profane with a systematic cruelty that suggests something darker than mere greed. When people brought animals to sacrifice at Shiloh, the priests were entitled to a specific portion of the meat according to the law of Moses. But Hophni and Phinehas were not content with their allotted share with what had been designated as rightfully theirs. They wanted more. They wanted the best. They wanted what belonged to God. They would send their servants to threaten worshippers, demanding the choicest cuts of meat before the fat was even burned on the altar, as required by law. The fat belonged to God. That was non-negotiable in the sacrificial system. The burning of the fat was the moment when the sacrifice became truly sacred, when the offering transitioned from human gift to divine acceptance. But Hophni and Phinehas did not care about divine acceptance. They cared about their appetites. If people objected, if they tried to follow the proper procedures and insist that the fat be burned first, the servants would respond with threats of violence. We will take it by force if necessary. The priests were literally stealing from God, taking what belonged to the altar and consuming it themselves. They were turning worship into extortion, using their position of spiritual authority to exploit the vulnerable and the faithful. But their corruption went even darker into territories that the text only hints at with uncomfortable brevity. They engaged in sexual immorality with women who served at the entrance to the sanctuary. These were women who had dedicated themselves to service at the tabernacle, who came to worship and serve with sincere devotion. And Hophni and Phinehas exploited them, used their authority and position to prey upon those who should have been under their protection. They turned the house of God into a place of exploitation and abuse, where the very people who were supposed to represent divine holiness became perpetrators of trauma. Worship became a source of fear rather than transcendence. People stopped coming, or when they came with cynicism and resentment, going through the motions but empty of faith. How could you trust a system where the gatekeepers were predators? How could you believe in the holiness of a place where the priest defiled it daily? The sanctuary at Shiloh, which was meant to be the central hub of Israel's spiritual life, became instead a monument to religious corruption. Eli knew what his sons were doing. The text makes this painfully clear. People told him they came with reports of misconduct, of abuse, of exploitation. He heard the rumors and saw the evidence. He was not ignorant. He was not blind to their crimes. And to his credit, he confronted them. But his rebukes were weak, almost apologetic, carrying no weight and no consequence. Why do you do such things? I hear reports from the people about your wicked deeds. If someone sins against another person, God may mediate. But if someone sins against the Lord, who will intercede? The words acknowledge the problem but offer no solution. There is no threat of removal from office, no stripping of authority, no punishment that might actually deter the behavior. Just words, just disappointment, just a father hoping his wayward sons might suddenly develop a conscience they had never demonstrated. Hoffen and Feinhaus ignored their father and continued their corruption. Why wouldn't they? There were no consequences. Eli's position as high priest gave him the authority to remove them, to appoint others, to enforce standards. But he did nothing, and his inaction was itself a form of action, a choice that enabled the continued degradation of worship. The impact on Israel's spiritual life was catastrophic. The text records it with devastating simplicity. The people came to despise the offerings to the Lord. Think about what that means. The sacrificial system was the heart of Israel's covenant relationship with God. It was how sins were atoned for, how gratitude was expressed, how the community maintained its connection with the divine. And people were learning to despise it, to see it as corrupt and meaningless, to associate worship with exploitation rather than with holiness. Faith withered, cynicism spread. A generation was growing up believing that God either did not care about corruption in his own house, or that he was powerless to stop it, or worse, that he did not exist at all, and the whole system was simply a mechanism for priestly power and exploitation. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this era, the detail that haunts the narrative with its implications, was not the corruption of the priests. It was the silence of heaven. The scripture records it with haunting simplicity. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. Think about what that means. In a culture where prophets and priests were meant to be the conduits between God and humanity, the channel had gone quiet. God was not speaking, or if he was, no one was hearing. Prophecies were scarce to the point of being legendary. Divine visions were so uncommon that when someone claimed to have received one, it was met with skepticism rather than expectation. But why? The text does not explain. It simply records the fact of divine silence as if it were weather, as if the absence of God's voice was as natural and unremarkable as a drought. But this raises uncomfortable questions. Had God withdrawn because of the corruption? Was the silence a form of judgment, a divine turning away from a people who had corrupted worship? Or had the people simply stopped listening? Had they become so cynical and so wounded by a religious hypocrisy that they could no longer hear what was being said? Or was there another possibility, one that the text does not explore, but that hangs in the air like smoke? Perhaps the priests who were supposed to be the mediators between God and people had become such effective blockers of communication that divine messages simply could not get through. Perhaps Hoffen and finance were not just corrupt individuals, but symptoms of a systemic failure, a spiritual infrastructure that had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Israel was spiritually adrift, navigating by dead reckoning through waters where the stars had gone dark. There were no prophets to consult, no clear word from God about how to proceed. No divine guidance about which way to turn, just the daily grind of existence, the hollow rituals performed without meaning, the slow death of a people's faith in the face of institutional betrayal. This was the world into which Samuel was growing up, a world where the representatives of God were corrupt, where worship had become hollow, where heaven seemed distant and disinterested. If you were a young person in that era, what would you believe about the divine? Would you expect God to speak? Would you even know what his voice sounded like? Would you be able to distinguish a divine call from your own imagination or from the voice of a very human priest? Samuel cleaned the lamps each evening, ensuring the light would burn through the night. It was a practical task, a maintenance duty, nothing spiritual about it. He trimmed the wicks, refilled the oil reservoirs, ensured the flames were steady. But in that small act, there was a symbol that perhaps Samuel himself did not fully understand. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Somewhere in the darkness, a light still burned. And into that darkness, cutting through the silence that had lasted for generations, a voice was about to break through. Chapter 3. The night God spoke. The night began like any other. Samuel had completed his duties for the day, working through the familiar routines that structured his life. The sanctuary was clean, the floors swept, the vessels washed and arranged in their proper places. The lamps were lit, their flames steady, casting dancing shadows across the ancient stones. The sacred space was prepared for the silence of the evening hours, for the long watch through darkness toward dawn. Eli, now elderly and nearly blind, his eyes grown dim from age and perhaps from seeing too much corruption without acting, had retired to his usual place. He moved slowly now, carefully, feeling his way along walls he had walked beside for decades. His sleeping area was separate but nearby, close enough that Samuel could hear him if he called. Out in the night, Samuel lay down in his customary sleeping spot somewhere near the chamber where the Ark of the Covenant rested. The exact location is not specified in the text, but the implication is clear. He slept in proximity to the most sacred object in all of Israel, closer to the physical representation of God's presence than anyone else in the nation that night. The ark was the most sacred object in Israel, a gold-covered chest containing the tablets of the law, a jar of manna, and Aaron's staff that had budded. But more than its contents, the ark represented the very presence of God among his people. It was the throne of the invisible king, the place where heaven touched earth, the point of contact between the divine and the mortal. To sleep near it was to sleep in the shadow of holiness, though Samuel likely thought nothing of it. This was simply where he slept, as ordinary to him as any bedroom, as familiar as his own breathing. The lamp of God was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. This detail matters more than it might initially seem. In the Jewish tradition, the lamp in the sanctuary, the menorah that burned with consecrated oil, was not allowed to go out until morning light made it unnecessary. It represented the presence of God, the light that persisted even in darkness, the hope that had not yet been extinguished. The phrase, "the lamp of God had not yet gone out," carries within it both promise and warning. Not yet, but it could. The light was still burning, but barely. The presence was still there, but fading. As long as the lamp burned, there was hope. As long as the light persisted against the encroaching darkness, God had not abandoned his dwelling place entirely. Samuel drifted into sleep, a boy exhausted from the honest labor of serving in the house of God. His breathing slowed, his muscles relaxed. He sank into that deep, dreamless sleep that comes from physical work and a clear conscience. The sanctuary around him settled into its nighttime sounds, the creak of cooling stone, the whisper of wind through high windows, the distant cry of a night bird, the soft flutter of the lamp flames. And then in the darkness cutting through the silence like a knife through cloth, he heard his name, Samuel. The voice was clear, distinct, personal. Not a shout that would echo through the halls, but not a whisper that could be mistaken for imagination either. It had the quality of someone standing nearby, speaking with intention and purpose, with the certainty that they would be heard. It was a voice that expected a response. Samuel's eyes snapped open. His heart leaped in his chest. There was no confusion, no moment of disorientation. He knew immediately that someone had called him. The voice had been too clear, too deliberate, too unmistakably directed at him. In the darkness, with the lamp casting its uncertain light, Samuel did what made perfect sense to a boy who had grown up serving us. Elderly priest. Eli must need something. The old priest was nearly blind now, stumbling in the darkness. Perhaps he had dropped something. Perhaps he needed water. Perhaps he was unwell and required assistance. Samuel threw off whatever covering he used against the night chill and ran to where Eli slept. "Here I am. You called me." The response was immediate, instinctive. "Here I am." Two words that would become the defining posture of Samuel's entire life. Not what you want. Not can it wait until morning. Just presence. Just availability. "Here I am." Eli pulled from sleep and confused, his mind foggy with the remnants of dreams, looked in the direction of Samuel's voice with eyes that could barely make out shapes in the darkness. "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Samuel returned to his place, perhaps a little puzzled, but not overly concerned. Perhaps he had been dreaming. Perhaps the transition from sleep to waking had jumbled his perceptions. Perhaps the old man had called out in his sleep and forgotten. These things happen. The mind plays tricks in the boundary spaces between consciousness and unconsciousness. He lay back down, pulled his covering around him, and closed his eyes, willing himself back toward sleep. The sanctuary settled back into silence. The lamp continued its steady burning. Outside, the wind moved through the hills with a sound like breathing. Samuel's heartbeat slowed back to its resting rhythm. Samuel again, the same voice, the same clarity, the same undeniable sense that someone was speaking directly to him, calling him by name with purpose and intention. This was not imagination. This was not the remnant of a dream clinging to the edge of waking. This was not the echo of Eli's voice misheard in the darkness. Someone had called his name clearly and deliberately, as real as the stone beneath him and the lamplight flickering against the walls. Once more Samuel got up and went to Eli. His bare feet made soft sounds against the cold stone floor. His breathing was quicker now, his confusion deeper. If Eli had not called the first time, then who had? "Here I am. You called me." Eli, now more awake and perhaps slightly irritated at being disturbed a second time, sent him away again with a tone that suggested both confusion and mild frustration. "I did not call my son. Go back and lie down." Samuel returned, but now there was a question forming in his mind that would not be silenced. If Eli was not calling him, then who was? Was someone playing a trick? Was there an intruder in the sanctuary, hiding in the shadows, calling his name for some unknown purpose? But the voice had not seemed mischievous or threatening. It had been steady, certain, intimate, the kind of voice that knows you, that has the right to call your name. He lay back down, but this time sleep did not come easily. His eyes stayed open, staring into the darkness above him. His ears strained for any sound, any indication of who or what had spoken to him. The lamp flickered. A moth circled near its flame. Time stretched and compressed in that strange way it does when you're lying awake in the dark, unsure whether minutes or hours are passing. Samuel, the third time, Samuel abandoned any doubt or hesitation. Someone was calling him, and if it was not Eli, then perhaps the old priest was confused. Perhaps he was calling out without realizing it. Perhaps his dreams were speaking through him. Samuel got up once more, faster now, urgent, and went to Eli. He stood at the foot of the old priest's sleeping mat, his young face barely visible in the dim light that filtered in from the main chamber. "Here I am. You called me." And finally, after decades of serving in the sanctuary, after years of watching the word of the Lord become rare and vision scarce, after witnessing the corruption of his sons and the slow death of Israel's faith, Eli understood. The realization must have hit him like a physical blow. God was calling the boy, not the high priest, not the experienced religious leader, not the man who had served in this place for decades. The boy who cleaned the floors and tended the lamps and slept near the ark without fully comprehending what that meant. Eli's response is one of the most beautiful moments in the entire narrative. He could have been jealous, wounded by the divine bypassing, bitter that his years of service were being overlooked in favor of a child. He could have been defensive, questioning whether this was really happening, whether Samuel was perhaps confused or making things up. He could have claimed the voice for himself, insisted that any divine communication should come through proper channels, through the established hierarchy of priesthood. But instead, Eli became a teacher in the truest sense. He gave Samuel the gift of understanding and the words that would change everything. He put aside whatever personal feelings he might have had and focused entirely on helping Samuel navigate what was about to happen. "Go and lie down," Eli said. And you can hear in those words both resignation and hope, both the sadness of being passed over and the wonder that God was speaking again at all. "And if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Those words, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Not "who are you," not what you want, not "prove yourself to me," just openness, just availability, just the humble acknowledgement that if God is speaking, the only appropriate response is to listen. Samuel returned to his place one more time. He lay down in the darkness, the lamp of God still burning nearby, casting its uncertain light across ancient stones, and he waited. His heart must have been pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His mind must have been racing with questions and fears and wonder. What does the voice of God sound like? What will he say? Am I worthy to hear it? What if I do not understand? What if I get it wrong? The silence stretched. The lamp flickered. Outside, the night continued its slow progression toward dawn. And then, for the fourth time, the voice came. But this time there was a difference. This time the name was repeated, spoken twice, with an intimacy and urgency that had not been there before. Samuel, Samuel. The repetition is significant. In Hebrew, when a name is called twice, it indicates intimacy, urgency, importance. Abraham, Abraham, Moses, Moses. Now Samuel, Samuel. This was not a casual summons. This was personal, direct, unmistakable. This time the boy was ready, following Eli's instructions exactly, word for word. He responded with the words that have echoed through millennia as the perfect posture of faith, the ideal response to divine initiative. Speak, for your servant is listening. And God spoke. What happened next was not what a child would want to hear. God did not give Samuel a message of encouragement or blessing. He did not reveal some beautiful mystery or share some cosmic secret about the nature of reality or the structure of heaven. He did not offer comfort or promise Samuel a glorious future. Instead, God gave Samuel a prophecy of judgment, and the judgment was against Eli's household, against the man who had been like a father to him, against the only family he had truly known. God told Samuel that he was about to do something in Israel that would make the ears of everyone who heard it tingle. That phrase, ears tingling, suggests something shocking, something that would reverberate through the nation like a physical sensation. This was not going to be a quiet judgment, a private correction. This was going to be public, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. He was going to carry out against Eli everything he had spoken concerning his family from beginning to end. There had been warnings before. A prophet had come to Eli years earlier with a similar message, speaking of judgment to come, of the priesthood being taken from his lineage, of his sons dying on the same day. That prophecy had been spoken and then seemingly forgotten, filed away as one of those uncomfortable truths that people acknowledge but never really expect to see fulfilled. But God was saying now that the time of fulfillment had come. The warnings were over. The judgment was at hand. The reason was clear and devastating. Eli knew about the sins of his sons. He knew they were blaspheming God, treating the sacred as profane, exploiting women, stealing from the altar, corrupting worship itself. He had heard the reports. He had seen the evidence. He had confronted them, yes, but his rebukes were empty, carrying no weight, leading to no consequences. He had failed to restrain them, failed to use his authority to stop them, failed to choose God's honor over his son's comfort. And that failure, that complicity through inaction, meant that the guilt of Eli's house would never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. Think about what that means. In a religious system built entirely around sacrifice and atonement, where every sin could theoretically be covered by the blood of animals and the proper rituals, God was declaring that some corruption runs too deep for ritual to reach. Some betrayals are so fundamental that the system itself cannot address them. Eli's family would carry their guilt to the grave and beyond, marked forever by their choice to prioritize family loyalty over divine justice. Imagine being Samuel in that moment. You are a child, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, lying in the darkness of a sanctuary, having just heard the voice of God for the first time in your life. And the message you have been given is not one of blessing or calling or future glory. It is a message of doom for the man who has raised you, who has taught you everything you know about worship and service, who has been your only father figure in a life marked by abandonment and loneliness. The weight of it must have been crushing. How do you speak words of judgment to someone you love? How do you become the bearer of bad news that will break someone's heart? How do you look into the eyes of a man who has shown you kindness and tell him that his family line is cursed, that his sons will die, that everything he has built will crumble? This was the cost of prophecy that no one talks about. This was the burden of truth that cannot be softened or avoided or delayed. Samuel had been given a message, and whether he wanted to deliver it or not was irrelevant. The truth had been spoken to him, and now he was responsible for speaking it to others. This is what it means to be a prophet. Not visions and mystical experiences and spiritual heights, but the grinding, awful responsibility of speaking truths that wound you as deeply as they wound those who hear them. The rest of the night must have been agony for Samuel. The text tells us he lay there until dawn, too afraid to tell Eli what he'd heard. He did not sleep. How could he? His mind must have raced through possibilities. Maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe there was a way to soften the message to make it less harsh. Maybe if he just kept quiet, the whole thing would fade like a dream, and he could go back to his simple life of tending lamps and sweeping floors. But deep down, he knew the voice had been too clear. The message had been too specific, and God had not asked his opinion about whether this was a good idea or whether Samuel felt ready for such responsibility. The divine does not consult us about our readiness. It simply calls, and we must answer. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Message. As morning light began to filter into the sanctuary, pale and hesitant through the high windows, Samuel rose and went about his duties as usual. Muscle memory guided him through the familiar routines. He opened the doors of the house of the Lord, pushing aside the heavy wooden barriers that sealed the sacred from the profane, letting in the day with all its ordinary demands. But everything felt different now. The air was heavier, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. The silence was louder, filled with the words he carried but could not speak. He carried within him words that would change everything, and he was terrified to voice them. His hands shook as he performed his tasks. He fumbled with the lamp wicks, nearly spilling oil on the floor. He could not meet anyone's eyes. Every sound made him jump, expecting Eli to call for him, to demand the message, to force him to speak the unspeakable. Eli, however, knew something had happened. Years of serving in the sanctuary had given him an intuition about spiritual matters that his failing eyesight could not diminish. He could sense the change, and Samuel could feel the weight the boy was carrying. He called Samuel to him, his voice gentle but insistent. And when the boy came, reluctant and pale, the old priest asked him directly, "Samuel, my son, what was it he said to you? Please do not hide it from me." Then he added words that carried the weight of both authority and desperation. "May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." It was an oath, a binding formula that made concealment impossible. Eli was not giving Samuel an easy out. He was demanding truth, however painful, however devastating. And in doing so, he was teaching Samuel one of the most important lessons of prophetic ministry. That truth matters more than comfort. That integrity requires speaking even when silence would be kinder. There is something deeply moving about this moment. Eli was giving Samuel permission to speak truth, even painful truth. He was not demanding a comfortable answer. He was not pressuring the boy to lie or soften the message. He was not using his position as high priest to intimidate or manipulate. He was simply asking for honesty, for the faithful delivery of whatever word had been given, regardless of personal cost. Samuel, to his credit, did not hold back. He told Eli everything, every word of the judgment, every detail of the coming consequences, every aspect of the doom pronounced against his house. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not try to make it easier to hear. He did not add comforting caveats or suggest ways the judgment might be avoided. He simply delivered the message as it had been given to him, faithful to both God and to Eli in his refusal to distort the truth. The words must have felt like stones in his mouth, each one heavy and sharp. He would have watched Eli's face as he spoke, looking for signs of anger or rejection or denial. But what he saw instead was something he had not expected. Eli's response is remarkable in its humility and resignation. He did not rage against the pronouncement. He did not question Samuel's experience or suggest the boy had misunderstood or imagined things. He did not blame Samuel for being the messenger or accuse him of disloyalty or ingratitude. He simply said with a weariness that spoke of years of knowing this moment would come, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." There is defeat in those words, yes, but there is also acceptance, a kind of peace that comes from finally having the truth spoken aloud, from no longer living in the shadow of unacknowledged reality. Eli had known for years that his sons were corrupt. He had known that his failure to stop them was a kind of complicity, a betrayal of his calling and his God. The judgment was not a surprise. It was an inevitability finally spoken aloud, a truth that had been hovering unspoken in the air for years, finally given voice and substance. And perhaps in some way, Eli was relieved that the silence had been broken, even if the words spoken were words of judgment. Perhaps there is a relief that comes from knowing, from having certainty, even when that certainty is terrible. Perhaps after years of wondering when the hammer would fall, there was a strange comfort in finally hearing it fall, in knowing the shape of the future, even when that future was dark. What Samuel learned that night and that morning was something most of us spend a lifetime avoiding. That truth is not always comfortable. That faithfulness sometimes means delivering hard words, and that love does not require us to hide reality from those we care about. Samuel could have lied to Eli. He could have softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details or suggested that perhaps he had misunderstood what God was saying. But he chose honesty, and in doing so he established the pattern that would define his entire ministry. He would be a prophet who spoke the word of the Lord without compromise, without concern for how it would be received, without fear of the consequences. Not because he was harsh or unfilling, but because he understood the truth, however painful, is ultimately an act of respect. To lie to someone, even to spare their feelings, is to treat them as less than fully human, as incapable of bearing reality. Samuel gave Eli the dignity of truth, and Eli received it with the dignity of acceptance. Chapter 5. Samuel becomes a prophet. After that night, everything changed for Samuel. The text tells us that he grew, and the Lord was with him, letting none of his words fall to the ground. That phrase, letting none of his words fall to the ground, is the ancient way of saying that everything Samuel prophesied came true. He was not speaking his own opinions or making educated guesses or offering the kind of vague predictions that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on how events unfolded. He was speaking with divine authority, and reality itself confirmed his words with uncomfortable precision. The prophecy about Eli's house came true exactly as Samuel had spoken it. The details are grim and worth recounting because they establish Samuel's credibility as a true prophet in a time when false prophets were common and people had grown cynical about divine communication. Israel went to war against the Philistines, their perennial enemy. In the first battle, the Israelites were defeated and thousands of soldiers died. In desperation, the elders decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh to the battlefield, believing that God's physical presence would guarantee victory. Hophni and Phinehas accompanied the Ark, treating it like a magical talisman rather than the throne of the living God. The Israelites shouted when the Ark arrived, a roar so loud that the ground shook. The Philistines were terrified at first, knowing the stories of what the God of Israel had done to Egypt, but they fought anyway. And in the battle that followed, Israel was utterly defeated. 30,000 soldiers died. And on that same day, exactly as prophesied, both Hophni and Phinehas were killed. The Ark of God was captured by the Philistines, carried off as a trophy of war. When a messenger brought the news to Shiloh, Eli was sitting by the road, his heart trembling for the Ark of God. When he heard that the ark had been captured and his sons were dead, the 98-year-old priest fell backward off his chair, broke his neck, and died. The priesthood of his line ended in that moment, cut off exactly as God had declared. It was a devastating fulfillment, but it established beyond doubt that Samuel spoke with divine authority. He had predicted these events when he was just a child, and they had come to pass exactly as he said. The word of the Lord through Samuel was reliable, trustworthy, deserving of attention. As Samuel matured from boy to young man, his reputation spread throughout Israel like wildfire. From Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the deep south, spanning the entire geographical extent of Israel's territory, everyone knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord. The word that had been rare, the visions that had been scarce, now flowed through this young man who had learned to listen in the darkness. But Samuel was more than just a prophet delivering occasional messages. God continued to appear at Shiloh, revealing himself to Samuel through his word on a regular basis. Samuel became the primary channel of divine communication for the entire nation. The silence had been broken. The channel between heaven and earth, clogged by corruption and complacency for generations, had been cleared. And the instrument God chose was not a powerful warrior or a cunning politician or even an experienced priest with decades of religious training. It was a boy who had learned to say 5 simple words. Speak, for your servant is listening. Samuel's influence on Israel cannot be overstated. He became the bridge between the chaotic era of the judges and the establishment of the monarchy. Standing at one of the most critical transitions in the nation's history, he was the last judge traveling on a circuit through Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpeh, settling disputes and administering justice with a wisdom that people recognized as coming from God. He was also the first of the great prophets, the founder of a prophetic tradition that would produce Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all the voices that would call Israel back to God throughout its history. When the people demanded a king like the surrounding nations, it was Samuel who anointed Saul, a tall and handsome man from the tribe of Benjamin, as Israel's first king. And when Saul proved disobedient and unfaithful to God, it was Samuel who had to deliver yet another hard message of judgment, who had to watch another man he had elevated fall under divine displeasure. Later it was Samuel who anointed David, the youngest son of Jesse, a shepherd boy with no apparent qualifications except that God had chosen him. That shepherd boy would become Israel's greatest king, the man whose lineage would eventually produce the Messiah. But beyond the political role, beyond the anointing of kings and the settling of disputes, Samuel represented something Israel desperately needed: spiritual integrity in a world corroded by compromise. In a time when the priesthood had become corrupt, when worship had become hollow, when the word of the Lord was rare, Samuel embodied what it meant to hear from God and speak his truth faithfully, regardless of personal cost. He reformed religious life throughout Israel, establishing schools of prophets where young men could learn to listen for God's voice and speak his word. He called the people back to authentic worship, challenging them to put away their foreign gods and serve the Lord only. He led the nation in repentance at Mizpeh, where they fasted and confessed their sins, acknowledging that they had abandoned God. And when the Philistines attacked during that gathering, Samuel interceded for the people, and God threw the enemy into confusion with thunder and lightning, giving Israel a decisive victory. Samuel demonstrated that God had not abandoned his people, that the silence had been circumstantial rather than permanent, that divine presence and power was still available to those who would seek them with integrity. The boy who once cleaned floors and trimmed lamp wicks became the conscience of a nation. The child who slept near the ark became the voice through which God spoke to kings and commoners alike. His authority came not from position or political power or military might, but from the simple fact that he had learned to listen and had the courage to speak what he heard, even when speaking cost him dearly. Chapter 6. The Legacy of the Story. So what do we take from this ancient narrative? What does it mean for us centuries removed from oil lamps and tabernacles and sleeping near the Ark of the Covenant? And perhaps more intriguingly, what questions does this story raise that it never fully answers? First, there is the theme of listening. God can speak in quiet places, in ordinary moments when we least expect it. Samuel was not performing some elaborate spiritual ritual when God called his name. He was not fasting on a mountain. He was not in a trance or a vision quest. He was sleeping, exhausted from a day of mundane labor. You are simply present in a sacred space available to be awakened. How often do we miss the voice of the divine because we are too busy, too distracted, too convinced that revelation only comes in spectacular packages? We wait for burning bushes and angelic visitations for dramatic signs and unmistakable interventions, while the still small voice speaks in the darkness, and we mistake it for our imagination or for human conversation or for nothing at all. Samuel teaches us that sometimes the most profound moments arrive softly in the space between waking and sleeping in the darkness, when our defenses are down and our minds are quiet enough to hear what has always been speaking. But this raises uncomfortable questions. How many times has that voice spoken and we have ignored it? How many times have we attributed divine communication to coincidence or psychology or wish fulfillment because we have lost the ability to recognize it for what it is? Second, there is the theme of obedience. Samuel's first response when he heard his name was immediate and complete. Here I am. No hesitation, no calculation, no weighing of options or considering whether this was a good time. Just presence and availability. Not what do you want, but here I am. Not let me think about it, but immediate response. Later, when Eli gave him the words to use, Samuel followed the instruction exactly. He did not improvise or try to improve on the formula or insert his own personality into the exchange. He simply said what he had been taught to say. Speak, for your servant is listening. Obedience in this story is not about blind submission to authority. It is about being teachable, about recognizing when someone knows more than you do, about trusting guidance even when you do not fully understand where it is leading. But there is something deeper here, something that troubles the waters of easy interpretation. Samuel was obedient to a voice he had never heard before, to a presence he could not see, based entirely on the instruction of a priest whose own family was corrupt and whose judgment had been compromised by his failure to discipline his sons. What made Samuel so certain that this was God speaking and not some other voice? What internal compass guided him toward trust when skepticism would have been equally reasonable? Third, there is the theme of humility. Samuel's greatness began in small acts of service. He was faithful in opening doors, in cleaning, in tending lamps, in all the unglamorous work that keeps a sacred space functioning. He did not despise the small things or consider himself above menial tasks. He swept floors with the same attention he later brought to anointing kings. He trimmed lamp wicks with the same care he would later exercise in delivering prophetic words. And it was in that posture of humble service, in the daily repetition of small, faithful acts that God found him. How different this is from our modern obsession with platform and visibility, with making a name for ourselves and ensuring everyone knows our accomplishments, with treating service as a stepping stone to something better, rather than as its own reward. Samuel reminds us that true influence is built in obscurity. That character is formed in the small decisions no one sees. That greatness is the fruit of faithfulness in little things, rather than the result of ambitious self-promotion. But again, there is a mystery here. Why Samuel? What was it about this particular boy that made him suitable for this calling? The text gives no indication that he was exceptional in any way. He was simply there, simply faithful, simply available. Which raises the question, are there others who are equally faithful, equally available, who never heard their name called? Is divine calling arbitrary, or is there some hidden criteria that determines who hears the voice and who does not? Fourth, there is the theme of responsibility. Sometimes truth is hard but necessary. Samuel's first message from God was a message of judgment, and he had to deliver it to someone he loved. This is the cost of being a conduit for truth. You do not get to choose which messages are convenient and which are difficult. You do not get to edit reality to make it more palatable. You do not get to withhold hard truths because speaking them might damage relationships or cost you social capital. If you are going to be a voice for something beyond yourself, whether you call that voice God or conscience or truth or simply what is, you have to be willing to speak even when the words cut you as deeply as they cut those who hear them. Samuel could have spared Eli. He could have lied or softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details. But he chose the harder path of honesty, and in doing so, he honored both Eli and himself. Yet this raises ethical questions that the narrative does not resolve. What is the balance between truth and compassion? When does speaking hard truths become cruelty disguised as honesty? Samuel was a child delivering a message he did not create and could not change. But what about us when the truths we must speak are filtered through our own perceptions and biases and limited understanding? How do we know when to speak and when to remain silent? Fifth, there is the theme of hope. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Even in the darkest period of Israel's spiritual life, when the priesthood was corrupt and the word of the Lord was rare and the nation was spiritually adrift, there was still a light burning somewhere in the darkness. God had not abandoned his people. He was simply waiting for someone who would listen, someone who would respond, someone who would be faithful with what was given to them. Samuel represents the truth that it is never too late for renewal, that no matter how far things have fallen, no matter how corrupt the systems or how cynical the people, there is always the possibility of a voice in the darkness calling us back to what matters. The light may be flickering, the wick may be nearly consumed, the oil may be running low, but as long as there is any light at all, there is hope for rekindling, for replenishment, for the dawn that follows even the longest night. But this optimistic reading sits uncomfortably with the historical reality. The lamp did eventually go out. The sanctuary at Shiloh was destroyed. The ark was captured and never returned to that place. The line of Eli ended in blood and disgrace. Samuel's calling did not prevent disaster. It only narrated it before it happened. So what kind of hope is this? Is it simply the hope that truth will be spoken even if it changes nothing? Is it the hope that someone will bear witness even in the midst of collapse? Finally, Peterkin, there is something unspoken in this narrative that deserves attention. God bypassed the entire religious hierarchy to speak to a child. He did not go through official channels. He did not honor the established order. He did not consult with the high priest or seek permission from religious authorities. He simply called out in the darkness to a boy who had no status, no authority, no credentials beyond faithfulness in small things. This is either deeply encouraging or deeply unsettling depending on your perspective. It suggests that divine communication is not controlled by institutions, that truth can emerge from the margins, that the voice of God might speak to those we least expect rather than to those we've designated as official intermediaries. But it also raises anarchistic questions about authority and order, about how we distinguish genuine divine calling from delusion or manipulation, about what happens when everyone claims to hear the voice of God, speaking contradictory messages. Samuel's story is ultimately about availability. He was not the most powerful person in Israel. He was not the most educated or the most connected. He was simply present, attentive, and willing to respond when he heard his name called. And that was enough. That has always been enough. But it invites us to ask, what are we available for? What sacred spaces do we inhabit, whether physical or spiritual or psychological, where we might be found by whatever calls to us in the darkness? And when that call comes, will we recognize it or will we mistake it for something ordinary, something explainable, something that requires no response? Epilogue, the voice in the night. Close your eyes and imagine that sanctuary again. The vast stone building in Shiloh, the oil lamps casting their gentle light, the shadows dancing on walls that have witnessed generations of worship and neglect. Imagine the boy lying near the ark, exhausted from a day of simple service, drifting into sleep with no expectation that this night will be different from any other. And then the voice, clear, personal, undeniable, a voice that breaks through the silence of heaven and calls a child by name. Samuel's story is a reminder that the divine does not always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it comes as a whisper in the darkness. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a question repeated until we finally understand that we are being addressed. Sometimes the most significant moments of our lives happen when we are alone, unguarded, simply present in a space where we have made ourselves available to something greater than ourselves. The lamp of God is still burning. That is the promise embedded in this ancient narrative. No matter how dark the times, no matter how corrupt the systems, no matter how silent heaven seems, there is always a light somewhere refusing to go out. And there is always the possibility that in the quiet, in the stillness, in the spaces between our busy thoughts and desperate prayers, we might hear our name spoken by a voice we do not yet recognize. The question is not whether the voice is calling. The question is whether we are listening. Samuel lay in that sanctuary as a boy and became a prophet because he learned to say 5 words that changed everything. Speak, for your servant is listening. He did not demand proof. He did not negotiate terms. He did not insist on understanding everything before committing to anything. He simply made himself available, and availability was enough. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Samuel's calling. Not that he became powerful or influential or historically significant. Though he became all those things, the real legacy is that he teaches us what it looks like to be genuinely open to transformation, to be willing to hear hard truths, to be faithful in small things while waiting for larger purposes to reveal themselves. In our age of constant noise and perpetual distraction, where silence is something to be feared rather than cherished, Samuel's story feels almost subversive. It suggests that the most important communications might not come through our devices or our carefully curated information streams. They might come in the quiet, in the dark, in the moments when we stop performing and simply exist in the presence of something that knows our name. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider the possibility that you too might be lying in a sacred space, even if you do not recognize it as such. Consider the possibility that there might be a voice, gentle and persistent, calling your name in the darkness. Consider the possibility that the most profound transformation of your life might not begin with a grand revelation or a spectacular sign, but with the simple decision to respond to that voice with 5 words. Speak, for your servant is listening. The lamp is still burning. The voice is still calling. The only question is whether we have ears to